In 1978, I went to film giant tortoises in the Galapagos Islands. At that time, there was really only one herd of giant tortoises that we could film. Unfortunately, it was the top of a great extinct volcano where they were grazing on the grass of the summit. The problem was, though, that there would be no water up at the top. That meant that each of us had to carry a jerry can full of water, which I can assure you is very heavy, particularly if you're carrying a bit of kit as well. So we set off and we got up there at the top, and would you believe the clouds were already down and it was pouring with rain. So we didn't really need our water after all. However, it was too dark and too wet to film, so we pitched our tents and went to sleep. But as it happened, we were in the middle of the tortoises' mating season, and the male tortoises were lumbering around looking for females, and they saw our domed tents and presumably thought that they were in luck. At any rate, they charged into us so that as we were sleeping, or trying to sleep, amongst us all this noise, we were suddenly invaded by a giant tortoise trampling over the tent to have his way with it. The programme was called Zoo Quest. We accompanied a man from the zoo who was an expert collector. And that man was Jack Lester, London Zoo's curator of reptiles. My job was to watch him and how he did it and to film it. But after the second Zoo Quest series, Jack Lester became very ill. So I thought, well, I'll carry on this Zoo Quest idea, and since dear Jack Lester can't do it anymore, I'd better do it. And the zoo were very happy to have the animals that we collected. So I became, by accident, a zoo collector. So on our next Zoo Quest, I took on a very different role. We now had the responsibility to collect the animals, to catch them and collect them. It was a very strange thing. My job was a television director. I wasn't supposed to know about the diet of birds of paradise. Nor was I supposed to spend hours every day feeding them and cleaning them and one thing and another. And I remember coming down from Paraguay, where I had been collecting giant anteaters and armadillos and boas and all sorts of things. And we came down to Buenos Aires airport, and one of the local people said, "Oh, another one of you lot. There's another Britishman, Britain, who's also got a collection of animals on the other side of the airport." And who could this be? And I made my way round to the other side of the airport and found Gerald Durrell. First time I'd met him, actually, and there he was with the same problems. And I remember going out for a beer and something to eat together and discussing how to cure diarrhea in armadillos, and saying, well, I was putting some earth into the condensed milk, with the mincemeat, because it's a bit rich otherwise, and otherwise they do get the squitters. Oh, absolutely, he said. It was quite an entertaining conversation. When we went to Komodo, which was in 1956, hardly anybody had heard of the Komodo dragon. In Indonesia, no one seemed very sure where the island was. Eventually, we set off with a fisherman who said that he did, but after a couple of days at sea, I had my doubts. I said to the captain, "You haven't been to Komodo before, haven't you?" And he said, "Belum." And I didn't know what belum meant, so I had to go down into the cold and find my Indonesian dictionary. I looked up belum and it said, "Not yet." So it was clear he didn't know the way. So I took over navigation, which was, again, a silly thing to do because I didn't know the way, but I knew it was west. And we sailed along the coast, and then I thought it was about time we turned south. We turned straight into whirlpools. The boat was spinning round, and we were trying to pole. Charles Lagos, the cameraman, and I were poling ourselves off, and the captain was sitting in the stern saying, "Oh, saya setengah mati, I'm half dead, we're going to die." Anyway, we finally made it. And I remember wading ashore across the Coral Lagoon and finding a tiny little village and saying, "Excuse me, but is this Komodo?" And they, yeah, Komodo, that was okay. I've been lucky enough to travel all around the world, to all the continents, and to some of the most remote places on Earth. From the Australian outback to North America's grandest of canyons. I plunged down into the depths of our seas and flown into the upper limits of our atmosphere. During my travels, I found a variety of ways of getting around, with some help from my friends. Not bad for a man without a driving license.
These are the mountains of central New Guinea. Right to their very tops, most of them are covered by dense tropical forest.
Up in the highlands, which were then really very little visited by Europeans, you suddenly saw these tribes people with hundreds of birds of paradise plumes doing a big dance. At one dance there may be 10,000 birds of paradise plumes. I mean, just an unbelievable number, and a sight of just such sumptuous beauty. It took a long time before I saw one displaying in the wild, simply because I was cack-handed and silly and inexperienced. When we finally saw them, it was in early dawn. It was against the sky, so it was soot and whitewash, it was silhouette stuff really, and absolutely fifth rate. But it was the end of several months hard work, and it was an unforgettable moment for me. And I think, in fairness, it was the first time that a bird of paradise had been filmed displaying in the wild. It ended up by us bringing back captive birds of paradise, had been collected by a bird hunter, and we brought them back from London Zoo, and it was one of the biggest and most varied collections of live birds of paradise brought to London at that time. And of course now it's prohibited anyway. But we bought all kinds of birds. We bought Prince Rudolph's bluebird, we bought Princess Stephanie's bird, Count Raji's bird, the superb bird, the magnificent bird, and the King of Saxony bird. And they were, I had the job of feeding them as we took them across from New Guinea, because we weren't allowed to go back into Australia because of quarantine. We had to take them around by Rabaul and then across the South China Sea and then by a freighter plane back to London. And I had them in my charge all this time, feeding them on cockroaches and whatever I could find. As well as filming during the day, by leaving our infrared camera to run overnight, we made some other discoveries. This is a summit rat. It too is making the most of the pitcher plant's nectar and its other facilities. And later that night, a second visitor, an as yet unidentified rodent making the most of the pitcher plant pit stop. So the pitcher is a service station for small mammals, open 24 hours a day.
First place we went to was here at the mouth of this river, the Mahakam River, which goes right into the heart of Borneo.
It was quite remote, and we were certainly out of touch with the outside world for quite a long time. There weren't, of course, mobile phones or any other means of communication. We travelled upriver and stayed with the local Dayak people, who lived in communal buildings called longhouses. I remember sitting on the longhouse veranda, was the front, and seeing a canoe coming in the distance, a long way downriver, and there was a little white spume coming from the back, and clearly there was a man paddling like mad, and this tiny dugout canoe, or canoe anyway. And I watching through binoculars and wondering idly who he might be and why he was in such a hurry. And in the front, the bows of this little boat, little canoe, there was a stick with a white rectangle at the top. And the naked paddler was naked but for a turban and a loincloth. And I watched him, and slowly he came right up to the landing stage of the longhouse. And he brought his little canoe up, jumped out, seized his stick with the white square on it, and came and gave it to me and said, "Tuan." And then that moment I remembered a phrase which I'd read in some of these early travel books about how missionaries or governors or whoever sent messages to one another in a cleft stick. And this was a message in a cleft stick. And it was the stick had been split, and the message was a folded piece of paper and then a piece of twine at the top. So you were opening the letter was just by undoing the twine. And the reason they did it that way, of course, there was nowhere else for the messenger to put it that you would want to read it at the end of the process. So anyway, we opened this with trembling fingers, thinking it was something appalling. And it was a message from the BBC film department to say that they'd done recent tests on some of the film we were using, and it would be advisable to use reflectors if we could get one. Well, they thought we were going to get a reflector in the middle of Borneo. I wasn't too sure, but anyway, we did our best.
When dealing with territorial and aggressive male seals, it's a good idea to carry along a big stick. But when filming wildlife, you often have to wait a while for the action to happen. So sometimes the crew needs a little entertaining. A masterclass in cheerleading.